For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ali Bedad, and I am the director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies. And on behalf of my colleagues at the center, I would like to welcome you to today's event to celebrate the publication and discuss our colleague Lamia Balafrej's wonderful new book, The Making of the Artist in Late Timurid Painting. Before I introduce our colleague Domenico Ingenito, who will be moderating this panel, I wish to say a few words about the CNES. For those of you who may not be familiar with the kind of work that we do here, CNES, Center for Near Eastern Studies, which should be distinguished from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, that sometimes get confused, is actually a research center, research hub, where over 100 faculty from humanities, social sciences, arts, and law school collaborate in a variety of research and pedagogical projects. It was founded in 1957. It is one of the oldest and most distinguished U.S. centers for interdisciplinary research on the Middle East, broadly construed. We provide a forum for the exchange of ideas and the dissemination of information within and beyond campus, offering cutting-edge research and fresh perspectives on the challenges and cultural richness of the region, the broader region of MENA. The center supports graduate and undergraduate instruction and fellowships in a dozen academic departments, research by faculty, student and visiting scholars, and exchange among scholars from around the world, and vital public programming on the challenges facing this broad region. Now, those of you who are graduate students, please keep in mind that we actually offer lots of fellowships. We have SLAS money and other travel grants for travel. So if you check out our website, the deadlines, in fact, are coming up, and so make sure you apply. I also wish to thank the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, my colleagues there who have also supported this event. I would like to also take this opportunity to thank Domenico for his great work in organizing and helping organize today's events. We are very grateful to you for your generosity and collegiality in making this event possible. Domenico, who will moderate the panel, I'll introduce the speaker. As some of you may know, teaches in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Culture a wide range of topics on Persian literature and culture. His research focuses on pre-modern Persian poetry, anthropology of ritual and symbolic representations, and geopoetics and literary archaeology. He has published widely on these topics and has a wonderful forthcoming book entitled Beholding Beauty, Sa'di and the Persian Lyric Tradition, which we look forward to celebrating its publication when it comes out next year. So please join me in welcoming Domenico.
Thank you so much, Ali, for hosting us and for making this possible. Thanks to you, mainly. And thank you to all the centers that you mentioned, the Program of Central Asia that I personally represent today, and of course CNES, the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and the Art History Department. I'm very, very excited about this event, which will be a semi-informal or semi-formal gathering in which we have friends and colleagues and gathering together to talk about this extraordinary book. I believe I'm one of the few people in this room who has read it already. Is there anyone who has read the book already? No? Just parts of it? So this is even more exciting. Wonderful. Wonderful. So, sorry?
Go around?
Sure, absolutely. Take a look at it and the book by Lamia Balafrej, we'll talk extensively about it. Lamia is one of the most recent hires at UCLA in the art history department, and she specializes in the arts of medieval and early modern Islamic world. Professor Balafrej teaches in research interests include painting and the arts of the book, intersection of materiality and aesthetic, art and its relation to labor and ecology, cross-cultural exchange. And I'm so pleased to also introduce to scholars who are visiting us and joining this conversation, and they will talk about the book from the personal perspective of their research. And so, in order to promote the conversation, we'll have a final floor open for conversations and Q&A at the end of this session. And I will introduce Kishwar Rizvi, who is Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at Yale University. Thank you so much thank you so much for joining us. And Professor Rizvi will be the first speaker today. And her recent publications included Transnational Mosque, Architecture and Historical Memory in the Contemporary Middle East, University of North Carolina Press, published in 2015. And then another publication is Emotion and Subjectivity in Early Modern Muslim Empires, New Studies in Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal Art and Culture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rizvi, who is the first speaker today.
Okay, yes. All right. Well, thank you, Lamia and colleagues, for inviting me. It's really such a pleasure to be here and to celebrate this book. I think it's really important for us to do such things, and so to share the work of new scholars, new projects, and to do them in a way that is collaborative. And I think it's too often that we think of academics and scholars as sitting alone in our own rooms and doing our research. And so a moment like this is truly something to celebrate, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to give a short talk. I think I'm not doing what I was supposed to be doing, but so we will try and do the best that I can. So this is really, it's circulating, it's a beautiful book, it's beautifully produced, it's really beautifully written as well. And like most first books that come from a dissertation, it's really rich in detail. And in fact, I feel like I haven't really read it well enough. I've read it just once, and I didn't have time to go through all the footnotes, which again give this whole other commentary that I encourage you when you get a chance to look at too. So before I talk about the book, and again I'll try and keep it short, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from the anthology that Domenico mentioned, which we edited a few years ago, which was on the topic of emotions, affect, and subjectivity. And can you hear me in the back? Okay, perfect. All right. And it's perhaps one of the reasons why I'm here. So the anthology aimed to raise new questions about our field of early modern art history and the Islamic world in particular, and Lamia certainly helps answer many of them. So I wish I had known about your work so long ago, but here we are, and we will talk some more. So artists working in the imperial ateliers of the early modern period were keenly aware of their role within the art historical canon. Genealogies were constructed of great artists, calligraphers, and painters, and albums were compiled of their works. The artist displayed his mastery over pen and brush, utilizing his tools to show his knowledge of older precedents, while at the same time creating that which transformed them entirely. The past, present, and future were mobilized through a mark on the page, through allusions and references, and through the materiality of the ink, paint, and paper themselves. By looking closely at the traces left by the artists, be they painters, poets, or architects, the art historian may gain insight into the cultural production of these great empires. And we were working on the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal, but I think we can apply that to the earlier years as well. Into the cultural production of these great empires of the early modern period. And we could discuss a little bit more, perhaps in the Q&A, what we mean by the early modern, what are the indicators, what might we say, why is this not medieval? And I think, again, Lamia's work really helps conceptualize that early modernity that we're trying to define and understand together. So, of course, over the past 30 years, scholars of Islamic art and architecture, in keeping with art history trends more generally, focused on the social and historical contexts of the work they study. Issues of patronage and politics were foremost amongst the concerns of art historians in particular, And this was, of course, a shift away from the formalist roots of a discipline, and I here mean Islamic art, that had earlier focused on questions of attribution and connoisseurship. And so much of this field that we represent comes from museological practice of connoisseurship, of looking for the hand, looking for the attribution, but not necessarily reading the text or understanding why they were made. So we start to see that change, say about 30 years ago, when people like Oleg Grabar are really important for us and for our study. And many of us have genealogies of another type lead back to Oleg, somehow or the other. Thus we now may understand the motivations behind great works of art and architecture, the ways in which they were funded, and the roles they played within their broadest political and religious contexts. Less work has been done on how those objects and buildings were received, and in some sense, how they functioned. For example, despite the use of the term Islamic as a descriptor of our field, there remains much to be known about the devotional practices in the early modern period, or the manner in which ritual spaces and objects were used. And here I want to point to the work of Christian Gruber, for example, who's really, I think, shifted the field in many important ways. Questions about reception and intentionality, as well as about audiences and their responses, remain to be fully addressed through closer study of personal diaries, portraits, and chancellery documents. The goal of our anthology was to further this discourse and contribute new research that expands our understanding of art and culture in the Persianate Islamic world. In the early modern period, the arts of writing and depiction were intertwined with the social practice of connoisseurship. So in some sense, what we saw replicated in the 19th century did have roots earlier on, and that's something that Lamia addresses as well. Modes of evaluation by kings and courtiers were tabulated in the prefaces of poetic and literary texts, as well as the emerging genre of art historical collecting in the forms of albums or muraqqa, and that's what this is a page from. The album prefaces, that is what sort of bound these books together, and you'd have a preface right at the start of it. The album prefaces became an important site for setting forth rationalizations for creating certain works and establishing standards for appreciating the arts of writing and depiction. And here, of course, I want to point to the really important work of David Roxburgh, right, on Persian albums. Calligraphic exercises were juxtaposed next to sketches by master draftsmen and artists, and you don't see it here, but there are other pages from this manuscript which have monumental calligraphy written on it, sketches, carpet designs such as you see on the left, textile designs, and so on. The traces of the artist's hands were indexed through physical gestures, and the impression made by a brush loaded with ink or a reed sharpened to perfection. The massive folios, collectively known as the Timurid Workshop album, provide opportunities for examining the criteria for judgment and evaluation in the 15th century. And these pages are massive. They're literally almost as big as this table. So imagine the experience of looking at them and encountering them in a small dark room in Istanbul, where they now are. And they require, you need two people to change the page, turn the pages, and so on. It's really a very embodied experience looking at them. They comprise mostly of calligraphy exercises as well as hand-drawn sketches and preparatory drawings. The album requires us to think of the embodied experience, as I've mentioned, of art, and what that meant not only to the makers of the artworks within it, but also those that encountered the object through visual and tactile means. In its gigantism, this image and this object, the album overpowers the senses of the beholder, especially if considered in the context of illustrated manuscripts, which were often designed to be intimate objects, though not exclusively, for individual reading and viewing. So most of the books that we have, and you have to tell me, I'm not very good, how big your object is.
It's
this big, exactly. So that's what I mean. It's such a much more intimate experience, perhaps, of looking and viewing. Monumental calligraphy, of which there are also examples in the album, would have been less unexpected, given that elite calligraphers were often commissioned to design architectural epigraphy and writing. Yet what spaces, physical and intellectual, would the large sketches of animals, lovers, and warriors have occupied? What was it about the Timurid period that inspired such a breathtaking object, in which works referencing other artistic traditions, European as well as Chinese, for example, were collected alongside other examples of Persian drawing and calligraphy? What was being represented through these enigmatic sketches, some like strange monsters, metonymic and sort of taken apart and recomposed? Preparatory drawings, poems, and to whom were they directed? And importantly, what did the production of the album mean in terms of the changing status of the artist? Questions about the individual and the political, the affective and the emotional, and the space of history within cultures of art making raise the implications for an expanded history of art that breaks away from its traditional disciplinary parameters and makes us really rethink how these works were perceived, used, consumed, if you will. And I think, and this is where I want to turn to Lamia's work, which I think does that and helps us think more deeply about some of these questions. Besides making an important contribution to the history of Timurid Iran, she takes on, quite fearlessly I may add, one of the most well-known manuscripts of the late 15th century, the Bustan of Sadi Shirazi. The text for the Bustan was written in 1257, and we will wait for your book to know more about that. But today, we're going to discuss the manuscript, which was completed around 1487 in Herat, and dedicated to the Timurid prince Sultan Hussein Baikara. So Lamia takes on not only this most beautiful of objects, but also perhaps the most iconic, if shockingly understudied, of artists, Kamaluddin Behzad. Here we have a page from the Bustan, and as you can see, it's the poet at the judge's court, and the manuscript today is in Cairo, in which the artist's name is inscribed here. Here you can see it, and it's right here at the end of this very beautiful, long, poetic text which describes, and there's a lot of poetry. And at the end, here we have this inscription, which marks the work, the amal, of Al-Abid Behzad, the devout servant, and which of course is an appropriately humble term for himself, which is quite common, but in the case of a mosque space, it works beautifully and it's appropriate, as I mentioned. It would, however, be incorrect to think of the making of the artist in Timurid painting, which is the title of the book, as monographic. So it's not just about the Bustan of Sadi, and it's not just about Kamaluddin Behzad. Rather, the book addresses a number of key issues that are fundamental to understanding the arts of depiction in the 15th century Persianate world, and here I mean from the Ottomans east. Okay? So Lamia touches upon topics that are important to the history of art, from portraiture to connoisseurship. I feel like I'm reading a eulogy for you, but I'm not. I promise, I really like this book, and it's beautiful. The study offers an important corrective and critique to a field that sees its roots, and this now I'm talking about art history, in the 16th century, as told by Vasari, in the Lives of the Artist, which is an encomium to Florentine and other Italian artists, with the pride of place, of course, given to Leonardo da Vinci, and sort of to Michelangelo as well. So he's sort of thrown in there. He's not his favorite. Vasari's idea of divinely inspired genius, his inspiration in the artist's hand, and most importantly, his individuality, have in many ways defined the ways in which art historians, even up until today, have approached questions of authorship and originality. And of course, in such a setting, not surprisingly, everything that was not European often fell short. So when one was looking at something like this, and Persian painting, when collected by Europeans in the 19th and early 20th century, was seen as simply miniature illustrations. That's what they were called. These were called miniature paintings. A strangely denigrative term, bound, of course, as they were to the codex. So they were sort of caught up in a book. The text wasn't often read, and so they were limited in many, many ways, conceptually as well as physically. Of course, using Behzad as an example, David Roxburgh dismantles this characterization, this idea of a limited discourse, and one that was constantly being compared to the Renaissance and artworks of the Italian Renaissance in particular. And he sort of dismantles this in an article that he wrote in 2000, in which he situated Behzad in the context of the Kitabkhane, or the workshop, and argued for the very different criteria of evaluation and judgment that Persian art required. In Lamia's book, she takes the discussion much further by looking closely at the works of art themselves and juxtaposing them against historical and textual evidence. So let me look with you, and I'll come back to this image as well, but I'm going to look with you at just two examples, and I'm going to be hardly doing justice to either the book or the works of art themselves, because there's much more that can be said, but you'll think of this as a taste of something to come, which will hopefully encourage you to go buy the book and read it. So let's start with the frontispiece. It's really hard to see as a reproduction, but as you can see, it's a royal gathering, and it shows some kind of an event taking place. In the center, this is Hossein Baykara, to whom the book has been dedicated, and we know this is him from other drawings done by Behzad, but others, courtiers as well. It's 2 pages, and of course we know that the book starts, you read from here to here, and you also enter into the space of the painting from right to left. So he seems to be surrounded by a number of musicians, but also perhaps inebriated men. There's a lot going on in the image, and there are many readings that one could give. I think one that Lamia suggests and is a very valid one is that this is also not just a courtly setting, which would be rather interesting in and of itself. It's not just documentary, but perhaps there's also an allegorical theme, perhaps also deriving from the fact that the Saadi's Bustan is a Sufi text, and that we may see this encounter between the Sultan and this young boy to whom he's giving a rose as one of turning away, of where the young man is turning away from somebody who obviously clearly desires him, and it can be seen as an allegory of divine love, and the beloved, this young man, being that very oh my god, I went way too far, as being that very unattainable unattainable goal, right, of unity with the ultimate beloved. It may also be seen as a didactic image, an allegory of power's corruption and the dangers of excess, because of course the image is full of people drinking and music and eating, and it's extremely opulent. And there's a third reading, which I'll return to later, which is that of play. And like I said, we'll come back to that in a moment. So if this is an imperial setting, why is the ruler, Hossein Baykara, decentered, right? So he's on the second page, not the first one, he's on the side. And who are all these people? How many events are actually taking place? And to what purpose? So Lamia suggests, and I'm very taken with her argument, that it is at this moment that we see also a turning away, not unlike the young man. The image itself is turning away from being illustrative, but also towards being an illusion. That is to say, the conceptualization of painting is now one of autonomy, and with its own inner logic. And I'm sorry if I think I'm not misrepresenting it. It just makes really interesting and intricate and beautiful arguments. In this excess of figures and richly detailed surfaces, the artist wants you to turn towards the material object itself as a source of wonder. As Lamia puts it, and I quote, late Timurid painting goes beyond what was necessary to convey the primary narrative. It used visual excess to test the limits of illustration and to foreground painting as material process, unquote. But works such as this, and this most deluxe of objects, were also evidence of the artist's skill and authority. In Yusuf and Zulekha, of course, one of the most important paintings that many of us have studied and taught from, that skill is brilliantly on display. There's so much to say about this image, from the manner of its construction, and I think you talk about the way in which there's a grid that is laid over it, and she studies the sort of breakdown of the image, and the sort of function both of text as well as images, and it's this really interesting Escher-esque movement through it. Again, of course, many have seen, and the story of Yusuf and Zulekha is that of unattainable love, once again. And if you get, the way the dynamism of the image is precisely because it moves away from the orthogonal, because things are going in diagonals. It's one of those things that you can get very nerdy about. And the juxtaposition of text and image is really doing very interesting things. But the other interesting and important question that Lamia raises is that of authorship, and as we understand it through the textual mark, the signature. And once again, we have the name of Behzad here, not in a very large cartouche sort of showing itself, but here hidden in this little doorway at a slight slant that you have to look for. She raises the paradox of inscribing and hiding Behzad's name in this painting, and we wonder what's exactly going on here. So again, I'm going to rely on you. I'm sorry. I quote, yet the signature's placement and appearance complicate their referential mark. The portrait of Behzad conveyed by the signature is so hyperbolic that it actually threatens the referential function of the proper name, the assumption that the proper name refers to an actual person. So in some sense, what she's suggesting is that what happens when we find Behzad in this mark? What is his name, and what is it a trace of his presence? And especially in the absence of the brush stroke, in the absence of our ability to see literally his hand. As we know, first of all, these paintings are collaborative. They were done, somebody came in and did the coloring, somebody came in and then gilded it, and then somebody came and polished it. So there are many, many hands here, and the whole point is that each of them gets subsumed in the collective. And not only that, because of the high gloss of it, because of the sort of highly finished nature of the object, the hand disappears. So in many ways, in this disappearing is where Behzad is revealed, or at least his genius is. And not only that, but he also creates, and that's something we see in these paintings, and she looks at them very closely to suggest that there's this idea not of a world that is recognizable, not spaces that we can really encounter, but a world that is possible. And that, of course, is through our imagination. That's what the artist does, is evoke a sense of wonder, but also marks his own brilliance through it. So I think we could keep talking about many of these, and that's not my role, and Margaret is going to do, I think, more studies of this nature. So I'm going to end with a few questions, perhaps, for when we sit down together, and not so much a critique as an invitation, really, for us to think more and think together. So going back to my earlier point of reception of these works, sometimes denigrated, they're often denigrated, and sometimes have been as repetitive, and yet they are, of course. So what do we make of this question of repetition? Roxburgh argues that it's an issue of genealogy. And indeed, the images in the genre of both poetry and painting build on precedents, on a very self-conscious idea, in fact, of history, right? So that you're sort of placing yourself in these lineages. If the work is a response, that is, if it's a response to history, to the work of another artist, the jawab, if you will, it's an answer, then the question is, what is the sawal, what is the question, right, that is being asked here? And I think you do allude to it, Lamia, that perhaps it's in the discussion of autonomy, but where the work itself is reflexive and mobile. But I'd like to hear more about what that question is, that fundamental question that they're trying to reach. And in fact, in that case, do we need Behzad at all? If the artwork becomes itself autonomous and self-reflexive, what need of the hand or the identity of any individual? And in fact, Barbara Mundy and Aaron Hyman have done some really interesting work on colonial Latin American art of the same period, which in fact very self-consciously marks itself at its absences, right? So you don't see the signatures. The whole point is to look like something else, like this European original, right? So if it looked like the work of a Latin American artist, it would no longer function. So do we need Behzad? Indeed, we might say that the painting and its makers work very hard to suppress the identity of the artist, and yet not. And yet we have these biographers and chroniclers who keep tabulating their lists, and you make really wonderful use of them, just like the Sari, a continent away. Daulat Shah and Dost Muhammad are not unproblematic figures in this story. They're not just documentarians. How can we attend to their authorial voices, their ambitions, loud and opinionated as they are? And lastly, I would end wondering what the experience of reading the Bustan would be like. This small book, this intimate object. It is thankfully one of the few objects upon which the violence of dismemberment hasn't been done, right? It's still intact. So for many of us working on pieces of paper that have been put up in museums or torn away from the book, it's very difficult. But here's an object that is still intact. I want to know, what does that mean? What does that do for you, reading, encountering the visual alongside the textual? Looking once again at this mosque scene, or contemplating the divine body of Yusuf in the previous image, was to consider the beauty of God. Yet the painting studied here also drew attention away from the contemplative and towards the viewer's own pleasure and subjectivity, bringing the divine into the realm of human experience. What then do we do about the very everyday act of reading, of turning the page, of seeing beautiful writing and beautiful images? What is the response required of us, imagined, us as we imagine it as the readers, sitting perhaps alone or in a gathering, playfully looking for the hidden signatures, happily disoriented by the visual and semantic experience? So these are some of the questions I want to leave you with, and I'll stop and we'll let Margaret continue. Yeah?
Thank you so much, Professor Rizvi, for such a rich introduction to this book. And I would like now to introduce Professor Margaret Graves from Indiana University, Bloomington. She's assistant professor of Islamic art and architecture. She received her PhD from the University of Edinburgh in 2010. She's a specialist in the plastic arts and has published articles, books, and exhibition catalogs of medieval and 19th century artistic production of the Islamic world, including a recent monograph, Arts of Allusion, Object Ornament and Architecture in Medieval Islam. Please join me in welcoming Professor Graves.
Thank you very much. I'd like to join Kishvar in thanking Lanya and also Christian, who organised us so brilliantly to get here. One of the really nice things about this event, I was just thinking as you were speaking, it's not very often that we get to wholeheartedly and publicly talk about how much we like our colleagues' work. So feels like a particularly nice thing to be part of. I am really a medievalist, so I'm kind of coming at this from the other side. I'm also a specialist in the plastic arts, so the three-dimensional arts, so my world is quite sort of lumpy, and it's full of clay and molten metal and things like that. So I wanted to pick up on some of what are for me the really exciting frameworks that emerge from Lamia's book, which I think have much bigger implications. So I went full conference paper style, so I'm going to try to just read this in the most animated way I can. Professor Balafrej's book opens for me a very welcome series of new perspectives on painting and on image production at the beginning of the early modern period. One of the great achievements, I think, of this book is its really successful and very sustained exploration of a model of producing and apprehending painting, which is simultaneously absolutely particular to the late Timurid context in Herat, but at the same time has some very important implications for much broader questions about the nature of the painted image and the very act of depiction. I've been thinking about some of the frameworks that she's used for identifying specifically the question of artistic self-expression, self-representation in Timurid painting, and she's shown us how that can look quite different from the models for painterly reflexivity that we have inherited from European representational practices. Now, if you're in Middle East studies, that may seem like a bit of it's so obvious it barely needs stating, but actually art history is still so dominated by a set of tools that have come out of the European context that we are still trying to sort of work around how we present the alternatives, how we even give them names or talk about them. So her book, I think, really opens the door for interpretation not just of one superlative manuscript, although it is wonderful to see this manuscript finally getting the kind of analysis that it really deserves, but also, I think, for opening up the act of representation and self-representation in the Islamic context. Art historians, we all go to the same ones. I've chosen the same two, in fact, that Kishwara we focused on. Make of that what you will. I want to use some of Lamia's points of particular focus in the book, especially her ideas about visual abundance and linear exactitude. One of the things that is impossible to convey in these images unless you see them in the flesh is their tiny minuteness. Every time I take students to see miniature paintings, I tell them beforehand, you're not going to believe how small it really is. And they go, yeah, and then they go, when they see it. They cannot believe it. So part of this, her terminology, I think, is really important because it's given us tools for talking about that tininess, which is not often actually discussed. I want to carry some of these ideas backwards in time from this early modern moment, which Kishwar has so beautifully sort of elucidated for us as well, to consider possible prehistories of image making as process and performance in the Islamic world. Doing this, I hope, is going to add to the case for a set of Islamic hate models that provide alternatives to the very Aristotelian conception of naturalistic mimesis. Instead, looking at a set of frameworks that work elusively, the word illusion is an important one here, comparatively and performatively, and are, as Lamia's book shows, very intertwined with literary and poetic developments. So I will talk in a minute about who these guys are, but I'll give you some background. So the Arabic and Persian textual traditions that were really invigorated in the sort of 10th to early 13th century period have left us with a very small but very important collection of descriptions of image making. These are often framed within legends of painterly prowess. Images in these descriptions are durational, they are cumulative, and they are often, though not exclusively, produced through competitive performance, quite often involving multiple artists. When we read these early descriptions of image making, wonder and verisimilitude emerge as really critical concerns, making these very key documents for theories of the image and viewership. However, there is a further thematic thread that I can identify within these textual descriptions of images, which hasn't generally been remarked so much, which is their emphasis on image making as process. They frame painting and drawing primarily as live acts of performance and process. And doing this, the early textual records give us access to a medieval Islamic conception of the image, not only as a thing of wonder, but also as a dynamic and fluctuating entity with temporal duration. In this way, the image maker's art is represented actually quite repeatedly, especially in the Arabic sources, as a durational praxis rather than one that's indexed solely or even really primarily by a static completed artifact. Now we can see this most clearly in descriptions of painting competitions and artistic one-upmanship, especially those that talk about artists who really ostentatiously complete a previous or supersede a previously existing image. Now these writings are to some extent topoi, and I'm aware there are probably a lot of literary specialists in the room. They have rhetorical functions, and I don't discount that. They also have very interesting parallels when you look to both the classical Mediterranean sources and the Tang Chinese sources too. They make frequent recourse to artists from elsewhere, typically Greece and China, but also sometimes India is invoked as well. However, for all that, I think these stories do provide important points of access for conceptualizations of the image and image making. So with that in mind, I want to bring in one particular early Arabic description of an image that hinges on a moment of superlative draftsmanship as a source of wonder. This is a very brief passage in the Epistles of the Ikhwan al-Safa, a text that most likely probably reached its completion in, we think, early 10th century Basra, although there's a lot of controversy about it. The Ikhwan's discussion of image making appears within a section of the 8th epistle, which is the one on crafts. The part that it's in is specifically about the nobility of the practical arts, and it's about the distinction between materials and skill. I apologize to the Arabists that I didn't actually put the Arabic text on, but I've just had so many bad experiences with PowerPoint scrambling it. So this is the anecdote. It's relatively short. It's said that a man made, in some places, images and modelled forms depicted with pure pigments and radiant colours. Those who gazed upon them were astonished at their beauty and splendour. But there was a defect in the workmanship. Eventually they're passed by a skilled and clever artist who contemplated them and then denigrated them, took a piece of charcoal from the road, and alongside these depictions drew an image of a black man who seemed to gesture with his hands to the viewers. Thereupon the onlookers turned their gaze towards this, away from those other images and pigments, to looking at it and to wondering over the marvellousness of its production, the excellence of its marking, which I have interpreted to mean draftsmanship, and the animation of its form. Now, within this text, of course, the contrast between materials and skill is the immediate point of the anecdote, but it's doing much more than just illustrating a philosophical paradigm. In showing how an artist who lacks true skill cannot produce the impression of verisimilitude in animation, even with the most luxurious materials, this text presents a remarkably strong statement on the value of draftsmanship as performed by a master. I don't think we should just discount this as something that's just a topos or a trope. The choice of charcoal, which of course is the most humble of the drawing materials, using that, it's possible that the authors have in mind some version of the tale of the legendary Greek painter Apelles and his encounter with Ptolemy. Ptolemy hated him. Apelles turned up at Ptolemy's for dinner one night, and when Ptolemy said angrily, "Who invited you?" in reply, Apelles picks up charcoal from the fireplace and starts drawing the king's jester on the wall, and his skill is so incredible that within the first few lines of the drawing, the jester is recognizable. So this is a very well-worn story about artistic excellence. Simultaneously, though, I think also the Ikhwan's interest in draftsmanship as a performance can also be aligned with the descriptions that we find in Tang-era texts in 9th century China, where process and performance of drawing seem to be really more important than the drawing itself. There are other examples in India too that I could go off and bring in here, but of course this is not the space for those. But what I want to say is that by setting this story, the Ikhwan story of the man, alongside those parallel texts, it becomes possible to recognize this both as a localized and particular discussion of image making and as a participant in a much, much larger Eurasian koine of pre-modern tales that encounter the image as a multi-authored performance. Now, there's loads more that could be said about this text, including, of course, the issue of race, which is an extremely interesting one here. I'll limit myself right now to saying that while the anecdote does climax in the onlooker's astonishment at an image, it nonetheless frames image making first and foremost as a process. The triumph of draftsmanship is created as a live performance, which is executed in direct response to the earlier artworks made with more luxurious materials but less skill. And it's important that you cannot picture the earlier artworks. You're not told the subject of them. So there is an active visualization that's possible with the charcoal drawing that isn't possible with the earlier ones. The Icon's tale further undermines the idea of the image as a static artifact by accentuating the animation of the image, that appearance of movement and life being by definition something that we experience temporally. The spontaneity of the charcoal drawing's production destabilizes any sense of closure or completion to the art object, both by modifying the earlier artworks and by flaunting its own material impermanence. So it's very ostentatious that this is not even a permanent thing. Charcoal is a very easily lost drawing instrument. The image is not a stable artifact, but a process in flux. Now, at this point, I want to switch to a different tale of competitive image making that stands as a kind of fulcrum from the medieval textual descriptions of image making to the early modern painterly realm of Balafrej's analysis. These images will be wearyingly familiar to art historians. They're ones that tend to come up a lot when we talk about vision and visuality. But I do think they're important, and I want to talk also about the other versions of this scene that are less frequently illustrated. So these come from the famous tale of the competition between the Greek and the Chinese artists as recounted in the 12th century Khamsa of Nizami. These are the three best known ones. For anyone who doesn't know the story, basically what you have is a dispute about whether the Chinese or the Greeks are superior in artistic skill. This is to be settled by giving one wall of a vault to each of these people. So they have one side of a vault to decorate, and then a curtain gets hung in the middle so that they can't see each other's work in progress. When it's all finished and the curtain is raised, the images are revealed to mirror each other. This is because, in fact, the Chinese have polished their surface so that it perfectly reflects the painting on the Greek side. The illusion created by the polished surface on the Chinese side is such that it's only when the curtain is lowered again and the Chinese image disappears that it becomes apparent what has actually happened here. Now, this story has become the paradigmatic tale of Islamic visuality. Versions of it appear in Arabic, they appear in Persian, and in Ottoman Turkish. The only significant illustrative tradition that goes with the story is found in the Nizami manuscripts, and it's in a relatively small number of Khamsa manuscripts. All of them made in the 15th or early 16th century, and all bar one of those can be attributed to Shiraz or to Western Turkmen Aram. So this seems to be quite a localized phenomenon, which is an interesting thing in and of itself. Now, like I said, three of the best known illustrations are these, and these three show the moment of revelation when the curtain has been raised. Art historical scholarship on this scene has really tended to focus on these three, citing them as manifestations of specifically Islamic models of image perception and visuality. And they have been reproduced more frequently. However, there are a whole bunch of other versions of the scene, well, not a whole bunch, but a couple more than we have here, basically, that show artists at work. They are actually more numerous, but they're much less often reproduced. These are two of them here. The other paintings of the scene show both painting and polishing in action. So one of the things I would draw your attention to is what the figures are actually doing. One really interesting thing is there is a close focus across several of these on the actual instruments that the polishers are using, which are very interesting. There's almost always some paint on the wall on the Greek side. What you have here is a finished bit of wall decoration over there. I think that's the only one that doesn't show anything actually on the wall on the Greek side. Overall, the paintings of this episode, especially the images that really linger on the processes of production, like these ones do, are of interest not just as a record of material practices, but also as a self-reflexive distillation of a painterly idiom that can unfold multiple conceptualizations of the graphic arts, deftly and very self-consciously, into a single field. And this is the point at which I think we're speaking more directly to some of the ideals of visual abundance and sustained looking that Lamia has talked about as well. Persianate manuscript painting is an art of process. However confoundingly non-manufactum its images can sometimes appear, and this is something Lamia talks about in detail in the book. The 1488 Bustan is the superlative example of these images that do not look like they could have been made by human hand because they are so fine and so finished. The attention that's paid in these images, which are not nearly as fine as the one that Lamia talks about, the attention that's been paid to the processes of production in these images. So we have wall burnishing, we have painting, we have paper burnishing by analogy with the wall burners too. Signals an ongoing conceptualization of image making as an art of process, here enfolding the act of making into the image itself. Sometimes, however, and this is where if we step away from things like the 1488 Bustan, sometimes process is actually much easier to see, and once you go down the material to the sort of lower levels. This one I want to bring your attention to. Stylistically and spatially, this is probably the simplest one. It's also the most stylistically divergent from the rest. It's probably done in India. It's the one that wears its own production processes most clearly, and contained within it is a trace of the painting process that acts almost like an unintended meta-commentary on what is already a very reflexive scene. So if you look, I don't know how clear it is, this is always dependent a bit. I got that, yeah. There's a ghost figure here. You can see the ghost in the wall. There's the faint outline of a human figure who at one point actually shared the space here. So this figure is here. The ghost figure arm is raised, he's holding something to the wall. Undoubtedly what he was doing was also polishing originally with a stone, the way that the remaining figure is on that side. It's very hard to know why this figure was abandoned during the painting process. At the moment I just think it's probably aesthetic revision. The space is so cramped on this side that it really wouldn't have actually looked very good to have that figure there, and he's almost in exactly the same pose as this one. The plain field that is left, though, even though that's not completely plain, acts as a kind of synecdoche of the process of burnishing that the image depicts, because this is, in fact, this surface here is very highly burnished. When you tip this page, you get the light bouncing right back at you off this surface. So we have this kind of enfolding and reference to the processes of making, which are different from what Lamia is talking about, but I think also operating kind of perhaps a little bit, slightly earlier, some of them, operating a little bit out of a medieval, a set of medieval ideas about image making. It's very striking that the Nizami images that are particularly concerned with the processes of making in the image competition all use real-world wall painting examples as their models, whereas the three revelation images, if I could call them that, those three ones there, they all use figural idioms that are tied to art forms outside of wall painting in order to represent this moment. Two of them have models that really derive directly from the conventions of book painting, this one and this one, which is natural enough, of course, when you think about the medium of their execution. The third one over here has this remarkable close relationship with some of the painted depictions of tent textiles that we see in book arts. So these sort of turns of the painter's art, taking us through architectural decoration and book arts and textiles, these all layer the matter of art with its own depictions, and they harness several modes of material production into the regime of representation. Variations, I think the variations that we're seeing in the artistic paradigms that are used in this group, so we have those ones that show us actual wall painting as part of process, and then we have these ones that disclose fully complete images using other kinds of paradigms. I think point to an unfolding transition that's taking place in the late medieval, early modern conception of painting from a materialized and performative process to a thickening theorization of the image as an optical artifact. And I think this goes directly into the heart of Lamia's arguments. This returns us to the paintings of Behzad that Lamia has analysed so carefully in her book, and the reflexive possibilities of the medium within this emerging conception of the painter's art and the role of authorship. So I want to finish up by talking a little bit more specifically to the paintings in Lamia's book. Like I said, we just can't help ourselves. This is my students now for years have seen me kind of lose it in front of this painting, trying to describe to them what is so amazing about this image, and they never quite are fully there with me, but they like the spectacle, I think. This image, I have long used it as the kind of climax of Persian art, Persian painting when I'm teaching that bit. And Lamia's close scrutiny of it shows why this image deserves the superlatives that it has attracted. What she shows is how a means of representation could inhere within the painted image itself, not through mimetic reference to some sort of naturalistic external reality, nor through the index of extravagant gesture, but instead through wondrous detail and fineness of execution, through a microscopically precise construction of the painted page that completely confounds the eye and the intellect. It's very hard, actually, to take this apart. We can spend hours working on it. It's wonderfully productive, but it's very difficult, too. The image is both a virtuoso performance and, as Lamia shows, the obliteration of that performance. We know it to be a manufactured artifact made by human hands, but when we seek traces of human agency, we cannot find them. And this is combined at the same time with a depiction of space which is completely without parallel in the history of art. Painting of the Timurid era really pushes at the boundary of what is possible in two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional space, and it takes the architecture of the mind and of the senses and refracts that onto the page using a planar system that can be really radically experimental. If we look at something which is less finished than the Besad piece, something like this, this comes out of the Shirazi tradition. It's a very interesting manuscript. The painters of it were really consistently engaged with the question of how you get not just three-dimensional space, but experiential and even metaphysical possibilities of space onto the page. I can't think of any painterly tradition from any time or place prior perhaps to the 17th century where painting shows such a consistent awareness of its own mediating role. The experimental qualities of something like this are manifest in these really mind-bending architectural planes, particularly this. So what we have here is the corner of the floor, which is doing double duty, kind of serving as a wall simultaneously. And it's pushing up against these kind of concertina-ing panels of painted wall decoration above it. Simultaneously, you have the representation of both the inside and the outside of a space at the same time, taking place on the left, further playing with time, movement, and spatial experience on the page. Now, when you put this next to the Bustan painting, the consummate mastery of the latter becomes even more apparent. The Bustan painting is a supremely confident painting in every aspect of its execution. It's also a supremely intelligent one. The level of intellectual and manual dexterity in the composition, in the painting, and in the rendering of acute psychological drama through fields of kind of jewel-like architectural decoration. So by the drama, I mean this maze that traps and this kind of ricocheting effect we get as the quest for an exit. This shows us a mode of painting really at its peak. So the question is, of course, what remains after the 1488 Bustan? Where do you kind of go with this, within this idiom? Persianate painting practices do pick up various new challenges, but I think Lamia has shown that the 1488 really it's a unicum. I mean, the 1488 Bustan is something that stands alone. However, we do see the continuing intelligent, self-aware, and sometimes quite witty engagement with the painted field and its limits as a continuing idea in Persianate painting. Now, this image is not remotely comparable in kind of complexity, but it shows us painting that continues to think about itself as a practice. The drama of the episode, which is supposed to be the death blow being delivered to the lion over here, is more or less completely overshadowed by, first of all, the spectacular top of the tent, and secondly, this hilarious crowd of little people, little men, who are all trying to climb onto the text box in order to get away from this rampaging lion. They're trying to find a way out of the frame to escape it. I'm a medievalist, like I said. One of my main areas of expertise is ceramics, so I wanted to end with a piece that illuminates for me some of the possibilities raised by Lamia's book for thinking about other kinds of materials too. Lamia draws the analogy at one point that the Bustan paintings, and particularly the panels of architectural decoration in them, can be likened to the use of stamps in pottery moulding, in that they resist the search for the visual trace of human hands. Looking at something like this, which is an amazing piece, the walls of this are so thin, I still can't quite understand how it survived. But it shows you how this can be true. The stamp itself becomes the force that can be traced. So these are made by pressing a stamp into a mold, and then this piece is cast from the mold. So the stamp becomes the force that can be traced, and it's only at one remove that we can imagine the hand that pushes the stamp into the mold. But always, human agency will make its presence known one way or another. And just as the Bustan images pull us in ever closer as we pore over those hair-thin lines and we marvel at the human beings who were capable of producing them, So the detailed surface of this eggshell thin moulded jug invites both eyes and hands and eventually discloses traces of the fingers, you can see it here, that have pulled at the clay surface in order to stick together that line of closure between top and bottom. So I think I will leave it there as a sort of open-ended thing about the ways that we can pick up some of Lamia's models and use them in other areas too. They're definitely not limited to the 1488 system. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing with us such a compelling archaeological exploration, right, of the origins of what Lamia's book, right, represents, and how far it can go also beyond the limits of the date, right, in which these beautiful paintings were produced. Lamia asked me to share a few thoughts about the literary perspective, the literary dimension of her book. Her book is also extremely interesting from the perspective of the historian of Persian literature. And I would like to focus on a few passages. I have a handout here that, if you don't mind circulating it. It's just one page. I also have a miniature to show you, but this miniature cannot be represented on a screen because no one has ever seen it. And I will tell you more about this briefly. What Professor Graves was emphasizing at the beginning of the talk about the difficulty that we face when talking about art history and Persian literature as well, from a Middle Eastern point of view, Central Asian point of view, is that we're facing paradigms that were originally crafted in the Western scholarship, based on Western artifacts or literary works, right? So we all share, from the point of view of art history, from the point of view of Persian literature, the same kind of difficulty in trying to bridge the gap between those paradigms and the kind of different mindsets, right, that also belong to the framework within which the specificities, right, of these works of art. One of the problems that I wish to focus on today, following the example of Professor Balafrej's book, is the relationship between the text and the extra textual world. How do they connect to each other? And we have very strong preconceived ideas coming from the Western paradigms of mimesis, right? Of how the external world is being reproduced in a linear way within the artwork. And we constantly try to find a one-to-one correspondence, even in the literary work, right? Between what we see, what is perceived outside, as a source of information for us to understand exactly what the text is telling us. So we constantly try to find one-to-one correspondences as we are following the rules of scientific perspective, right? In which everything has to be scientifically being represented, and we need to break the code to understand what exactly the external world would look like within the text, right? So using the text as not appreciating the text for what it is from its aesthetic components, but using it as a tool at the service of a Cartesian kind of reality that we need to fathom and represent, right, in our world. So I will start, and I want to use this discussion, this critique that is found in Professor Balafrej's book, to also deconstruct the problem of mysticism and the relationship between the visible and the invisible world, and trying to somehow rephrase this problem from the point of view of artistic creativity and the role of the imagination in this back and forth between what is physical reality and what belongs to a metaphysical projection that is very present in this text, in this visual artifacts, and also in the literature that surrounds, right, the circulation of poetry and images between the medieval and early modern world. I'm sharing here a few passages that belong to scattered ideas that I have. I'm currently writing a review article on Lamia's book from the perspective of medieval Persian literature. The first passage relates to it's from the second chapter of the book, and it's an elaboration on on a passage that is found in an early 16th century work in prose by a certain Wasifi from Herat. And the title of the book is Badai al-Waghaye, the wonders or the marvels of the realities, the wonders of the things that happen, the wonders of what can be witnessed, right? And it's an extraordinary, witty depiction of the society of Herat at the time when Bizat was active, the court of Sultan Hussein Baybara, and the author shows himself as a young poet who is familiarizing himself with the poetic, literary, and artistic circles of late 15th century Herat. It's a beautiful work. It's not been translated to English. There are a few articles on it, and especially for the graduate students that are here, we really need specialists who are willing to work on it. And it needs to be re-edited because there are many problems also in the two critical editions that have been published so far, one in Russia and one in Iran. What is interesting is that from this work we can really get a taste of the physicality of the artistic experience in an environment of late 15th century Herat in which poets, artists, artisans, common people, people from the bazaar would rotate around this spectacular representation of a broad variety of human experiences. In one of these passages, in one of the key passages in which Behzad himself is represented, the author shows us what the effect of contemplating a miniature is in the circle of one of the most important patrons of the arts at the time, Alishir Nabai, who was the minister of Sultan Hussein Baybara himself, and who would always invite at court poets, singers, artists of kinds, and also painters. So this is the first passage that you find in the handout. Behzad once brought a painted page, Sahifa Musavar, to the paradisical and heaven-adorning majlis of the great Emir, Alishir Nabai. The painting represented a scene adorned with a blooming garden with many different trees, with beautiful variegated birds in their branches, while on every side there were flowing streams and blossoming rose bushes. In the middle of the setting stood the pleasant figure of the Emir, leaning on his cane, with plates full of gold in front of him for distribution as gifts. It's very interesting the way that Professor Balafrej frames this passage by comparing it with the function of the majlis as a setting in which poetry would be circulated and recited. So it's interesting to see how she explores this description, this ekphrastic description as something that can be compared with the way that poetry was performed in court. So on the one hand performing poetry, on the other hand performing visual arts. It's a unique example of this parallel here we find this passage. I was suggesting, we haven't really discussed it yet, well, I only mentioned this possibility, to read this passage, this description, as a qasida. It's interesting how it follows the model of the Arabo-Persian classical poetry or a poem of praise, in which there is a lyrical introduction that usually describes the beauty of nature, and then there is a transition towards the patron, so the recipient of the praise, and then in the end there is always a mention to, it's called husn talab, or to the elegant request. So the poet somehow in a very elegant way, subtle and elegant way hopefully, tries to receive some money or some gift from the patron. So it's interesting how to see how this portrait somehow represents originally in a visual text that has been retranslated in a prose passage, how it somehow embodies a structure that is primarily social. It belongs to the mechanics of the majlis. It belongs to the economy of the society. It belongs to, so it's interesting. It's not just a piece of information from which we can extract historical data, but it shows us how the dynamics of the artistic exchange can work, and we see how complementary the visual and the textual, the poetic can be in this context. And then the preparation continues when His Excellency the Emir saw and observed the forms of that delicate page. It adorned the gardens of his heart with the roses of happiness and the banks of the pools of his mind with the trees of gladness and contentment. While from the nightingale of his character and the branches of enjoyment, there came the sound of bravo. Sorry for my Italian. Mir Ali then turned to his guests. It's interesting also how in the Arabo-Persian, especially in the Persian medieval Qasida, we have always these deistics that are showing some sort of trace of the movements, of the physical presence of the actors that belong to the exchange, and how they are involved in physical gestures. So there is always a switch between the you and the they or him, right? In this text, it's interesting to see how now the main character of this depiction is shown in his own living action. He turned to his guests and asked them to define and describe the remarkable painting with all their wittiness. So you see the description with a description within a description. We can also see the architecture of this sort of framework within a framework in a way that's similarly crafted, similarly to the miniature of Yusuf and Zolekha, right, in Behzad's painting. Fasih ad-Din started off. When I saw those blossoming flowers, I wanted to stretch out my hand. So I should retranslate this. When I saw those blossoming roses, we're talking about roses, I wanted to stretch out my hand, pick one, and stick it to my turban. Sahib Dara went on in the same vein. I too had the same desire, but then it occurred to me that if I stretched out my hand, all the birds would fly off the trees. This could be, for us, from a Western point of view, reminiscent of Joktos, right? That counts also in Vasari, of the idea of drawing a fly that could be already almost touched by the hand of the beholder. This is extremely interesting because, and then the text talks about how other participants in the Majlis would somehow try to decipher this and compliment, right, and praise this painting by highlighting the realistic element, right, that is found there. It's interesting how Lamia criticizes all the attempts of reading a sort of a realistic depiction in this painting. And I have a few passages in which she says, the trope of illusionism was not about the iconic resemblance of the image to reality, but about the painter's prophetic capacity to fabricate and not merely reflect the world. And this was a rhetorical way to laud the artist, not an attempt at scientific, objective description. So this is something that we can read as a demystification of realism, and how what is really important here is the illusion, the illusionism, the illusionistic aspect of the representation, and how this can teach us, from the point of view of historian of Persian literature, how we can look at these works as ideal representations that function as catalyzers within their own society, within the social space, and how instead of looking for direct correspondences with the external world, we can try to use them as sort of as pathways, highlighting the purposes, the functions, the task, the purpose of the object of art, right? And in another passage from the 3rd chapter, I believe, Professor Balafrej says, for other scholars, late Timurid painting marked the emergence of a realistic genre in the traditional Persian book painting, visible through the thematic content of the pictures. Yet, the realism is not an obvious choice. Although extracted from an everyday life context, the extra-textual figures convey a sense of abstraction rather than realism. Stylistically, it is hard to perceive an interest in optical naturalism. Saturated with lines and colors, late Timurid paintings are opaque surfaces rather than transparent windows. Instead of relying on a single point perspective, they display a multifocal juxtaposition of figures, each seen through a distinct viewpoint and the same scale, regardless of their position in the real world. This means that the painting is, as Professor Grace also was underlying, effaces the signs of manual fabrication. It deletes, from a semiotic point of view, you could say that it deletes the signs of an enunciated enunciation. So this is the paradox of the artist's accomplishment, but also that it has to appear miraculous, inimitable. We do have in the literature of this period, at the court of the same patron, so Sultan Hossein Baybara and the minister Lishir Narai, we have examples of a recurrent obsession with the problem of imitation and intricacy, and the kind of relationship that is found between the effort of the artist of being inspired and inspired at the same time by reaching something that his peers cannot represent and challenging them to attempt the same kind of effort. Jomi, one of the most important poets of this period, who was also active in the same court and who is often also mentioned in Baraya Bagaye by Basefi, when he describes the work of Hafez, the great 14th century poet from Shiraz, who is featured also in Lamia's book. He says, this is the third paragraph, some of Hafiz's poems achieve wondrous inimitability. Sarhad Ijaz. Ijaz means also, it's a Quran, it's a way to describe how the Quran cannot be imitated. So it's interesting how here the poet is comparing the work of a poet to something that should not even be mentioned within the context of poetry, right, which is the Quranic imitability. Since in his works the traces of intricacy, asari takalluf, are invisible, he has been called the language of the unseen, lisan al-ghayb. This is extremely interesting because we see how something that we would read as completely detached from physical reality, like the invisible world, the unseen, right, as a mystical realm, in this period, in these works, has a strong connection with the work of the artist, with the physical work of the artist, and the way the artist performatively achieves this intricacy and erases, deletes the traces of this complexity. Which also makes me think of one expression that is sahli mumtana, which means, how did I translate it? Inimitable smoothness, which is a concept that for the first time in this period applies to the poetry of Sadi of Shiraz, so almost two centuries after his death. So he's an important poet from the 13th century, from Shiraz as well. And it's interesting how authors and critics literary critics of this period would describe the poetry of Sadi of Shiraz as inimitable and smooth at the same time. So it's impossible simplicity, inaccessible simplicity. And the way that they describe it is extremely to the point. They say that Sahli Mumtana is a discourse, is a poem that seems very easy to imitate. And as soon as the artist, as soon as the poet tries to recreate the same text, they will have to give up because they will discover the hidden intricacy of this. This is something that this description can fit very well, I think, the whole problem of how to create the highest point of intricate visual representation at the same time deleting, erasing, right, the traces of the hand that is there. So not showing the effort of that. And all this is intimately connected with the problem of the quest of the invisible world and how the invisible world can relate to the physical experience, right, within the court. And I will get to this very quickly. I really love the way that Lamia transitions from this idea, right, of the deletion of the hand of the artist to the actual techniques that were involved in this process. And so we have the other side of the page, paragraph number 4. She writes, after the execution of the underdrawing, the pigments were applied in a homogeneous, unmodulated way, creating a composition of flat, dense colors, enlivened by flashes of gold. The palette is dominated by primary colors, made with minerals and inorganic pigments. Blue, made from lapis lazuli. Vermilion red, made from mercury sulfide. And green verdigris, made from copper acetate. But whatever the color, one cannot see through the paint. This opacity is characterized as jismi in Persian sources, an adjective that means corporeal, substantial, or thick. After the execution of the outline applied around each block of color as a continuous line of black ink, the painting was finally polished with a burnisher. A highly controlled composition set with a myriad of intense, brilliant pieces of color. Behzad's paintings have a gem-like quality that recalls Timurid lapidary arts. Shining like a gemstone with its enamel-like polished surface, the painting looks self-made, or a though stamped onto the page, conjuring up the notion of archiropoieton, the icon made without hands. In Byzantine culture, such images were thought to be made by angels. And here we can go back to this idea of the poetry of Hafez that was circulating extensively in this century, at the end of this century, as something that he's hiding constantly the magic behind it. He's hiding the mastery behind it. He's hiding the tricks and the complexity and the takalluf. Right? It is perceived, so what we see, for instance, when contemplating the pictures, right, these images by Behzad, and we perceive that there is a grand, intricate design in it, but we don't see what brought the artist to compose, right, this composition. I really believe that we should, in the field of Persian literary studies, we should start bridging this gap and start thinking about the making of the poem through similar patterns, through a similar approach, in which we try to somehow unearth the perceived structures that would somehow bring, right, would elevate, right, the result as a process, not as a final object of contemplation, literary contemplation. And so we have a new argument that Lamia proposes. She says that in paragraph number 5, examining visual but also material aspects of the paintings and using a wide range of textual sources revealing some of the painting's reception, this chapter proposes a new argument. The visual density of the paintings, I suggest, was designed to project an image of variety and comprehensiveness. In their proportioned geometric compositions, the paintings do not reflect the world as we see it. They achieve a formal generality which, far from confining the picture to a representation of daily routine, was meant to raise the medium above its worldly humble status. Extratextual forms, moreover, developed in concert with the pursuit of technical perfection. With its smooth, polished surface, the painting obscures the process of its making, producing an effect of all-at-onceness. It works to place itself beyond the laws of materiality. Instead of reflecting the world, it appears to be a transcendent image, pointing to God's design. Severing its ties from both text and reality, emulating an uncreated image, painting, I argue, interrogates its ontological status, associating artistic imagination to divine creation. Professor Balafrej also traces a parallel between this idea of divinely inspired creation, or creations that mimic the divine act of creation of the world, to the concept of Lawh Mahfuz, the preserved tablet, which is supposed to, in the Islamic tradition, interpretation of this specific passage in the Quran, to contain the archetype, the matrix of the created world. And it's interesting how, I don't know whether Professor Graves mentioned that, there is, I think that the earliest attestation of the story of the Greek and Chinese painters, Ismail al-Ghazali's, Ihya ul-Ulumuddin, and it's a passage in which the Lawh Mahfuz is discussed, and the act of polishing one's heart in order to receive the reflection of the invisible world is discussed. It's interesting how the what we call the mystical or the spiritual aspect of this kind of artistic creation also can reveal for us a continuity with the very origins of this kind of discussions within the theological and philosophical background. And it's interesting how Bosifi himself incorporates, frames around the presence of Behzad also the discussion on the invisible world in passage number 6. Eventually, day by day, and and hour by hour, the dexterity of the master Behzad reached the peak of artistic excellence. Every time he would paint a miniature, the forms of victory and achievement would show him their countenance from behind the curtain of the unseen, pardeye ghaib. And I call this meditation as a critique of mysticism, because I don't like to use the word mysticism in this context for several reasons. We'll discuss this later. But mainly, I'm interested in seeing how the perception of the invisible world is something that is not relating to an achievable, unfathomable, distant universe, but it's something that relates to the act of imagination and artistic creation itself. And this is interesting to see how the invisible in Jami's gloss over the style of Hafez relates to the power of hiding the takalluf. And in Wasifi's words, it relates to the possibility of mimicking something that cannot be witnessed in external reality, but acts as if it were produced as an imitation of external reality. So it's interesting how this invisible here offers us completely new kinds of paradigms in order to understand what we call still in our scholarship mysticism or mystical poetry of it. So it's interesting to see how it's much more of an embodied practice and performative structure than an unattainable realm, right? It lays beyond whatever the physical world is. And one last point, I would like to compare the description of Vasily's description of Behzad's painting at the court of Lishir Navai with the passage from the introduction of Sadi's Golestan, the Rose Garden. And I recognize very interesting parallels between the two passages. So just to remind you that in Behzad's description, there's this idea that the beholders were trying to pick the roses from the painting. And there is also this degree of playfulness, right? As the painting is alive, is there, and our imagination is triggered by those images that we would like to penetrate whatever the visual representation is. In the passage number 7, Sadi, at the very beginning, in the Dibasha of the Gulistan, he says, one of the masters of the heart, Yekya Sahib Delan, entered into a state of visionary rapture, till drowning in the ocean of the unveiling. As soon as he returned from these imaginal transactions, one of his associates asked him with joyful enthusiasm, "What present are you bringing for us from the garden of sense that you visited?" He replied, "I was resolved to fill my vest with gifts from my companions once I would reach the rose bush. But as soon as I approached it and started picking the roses, the scent of roses intoxicated me so deeply that I lost control and dropped all of them." So it's interesting to see also how one of the representation of the contact with the unseen somehow is later rephrased, is refashioned in a way that involves the imagination of both the artist and of the beholder. So thank you so much for your attention, and the floor is open for I'd like to invite